So, for our discussion on foreign policy, I'd like to just take a look and start with something a lot of people assume, but might not know too much about. And the first is one of the things a number of students assume is that the United States spends a great deal of money on foreign aid. In fact, even sometimes driving around town here, I may see signs complaining about the large or excessive amount of money being paid in foreign aid. And then when you talk to people about it, their estimations of how much of the American budget is wrapped up in foreign aid is quite off, just off base. But if we were to look at the Office of Management and Budget, right, the one of the budget offices, this is how federal spending broke down as of, say, 2010. And so national defense got 20%. And you could say, well, some of that goes to foreign aid in various ways. Of course, that also doesn't necessarily mean invited foreign aid. Social Security, 20%. Everything else, 27%. Medicare, 13%. Medicaid, CHIP, 8%. Interest on the debt, 5%. Low-income assistance. By the way, most people who think that welfare is the largest expenditure of the federal budget, if we add Medicare at 13%, which is Social Security, you could say that those are some form of social welfare type programs, but these are things you pay into, right? So, and for old age pensioners, right? So you have Medicaid for those who are needy and CHIP at 8.1%, low income assistance at 5.3%, for a grand total of 13.4% of the budget, which is less than this, which is less than everything else, which is less than Social Security. So the question is where's foreign aid in this pie chart? Because I don't see it listed. So if it was a significant percentage of expenditure, it would have its own slice of pie here. And it doesn't. So we have to assume it's in the 27.4% of everything else. Now, here, what we can look at is how information can change perceptions about amounts spent on foreign aid. Now, most people asked about how much the United States spends on foreign aid. Do you think the U.S. is now spending too much, too little, or about the right amount of foreign aid? And 61% of respondents say too much. 13% say too little, 18% say the right amount, and 7% just didn't answer, either refused or didn't know. What if you heard that about 1% of the federal budget is spent on foreign aid? Would you still think the U.S. is spending too much, too little, or about the right amount on foreign aid? Or would you now say that the U.S. spends too much, too little, right amount? With the 1%, the plurality here said about the right amount, close by, too much, too little, close by, and don't know, refuse. So just about equally into thirds. And so the question becomes, how much is foreign aid as a share of the budget? Here you go. It's more than 1%, but not much more. It's 1.4%. So economic foreign aid and military foreign aid combined, okay, equal 1.4%. That's how much the United States spends on foreign aid. So one of the reasons I bring it up is because when we talk about foreign policy, one of the questions that students normally ask, and it's a really good one, it's like, how much do we actually spend on foreign aid? Because, the way we hear it, we was just like, oh, we just send a bunch of money to foreign countries to do anything, and, they take it, and we should stop that. But what we see here is that actually, 1.4% of, a $4 trillion budget is a significant amount of money. It's not the lion's share of our budget. So why then do we continue to give money to foreign countries, even though we don't give that much, but why do we give money to foreign countries in the first place? What's the goal? What are we doing? And is it true we can just hand this stuff out and, countries take it? And I think it goes back to generally the purpose of American foreign policy. A lot of times we like to think that, if I was to ask you what is the goal of American foreign policy, there are a number of policy goals that the United States has with foreign policy, and it has always had. It's that, foreign policy's job is to, provide humanitarian relief and all these other things. Let me give you, very simply, the most important rule of foreign policy. That's this. The goal of American foreign policy is to pursue the rational self-interest of the United States and its best interests in its relations with foreign countries. It is supposed to promote and protect American interests, American policy interests, American political interests, American economic interests, what have you. But the goal of American foreign policy is to preserve American interests, protect the United States of America, and promote its goals, whatever they are at any given time. And those goals change over time. So that's really the goal of American foreign policy. Now, we can also say that, well, wait a minute, we also, say we do humanitarian missions and everything else, promote democracy. Certainly. But we do so because we think it serves our best rational self-interest in some way or another. That promoting democracy in some parts of the world makes the world a more stable place for the United States to live in. That promoting free trade or a trade agreement with a country or a group will promote the economic interest of the United States. If it also provides for the interests of the other party, that's great as well. So, that is the goal of American foreign policy, hands down. Now, there are different types of politics that are involved in the foreign policy process. And as your book notes, foreign policy is something that is actually made harder by the idea of democracy. So, part of the problems is that sometimes in foreign policy you would like to have maybe more freedom of movement or operation. If you are a foreign policy expert or charged with negotiating, at the same time you also might like to be able to operate with less oversight, which would make things a lot easier, but not necessarily democratic. And in this case, what you have in the case of the United States, that is, you have that delicate balance between pursuing foreign policy goals and understanding how beholden those foreign policy goals are to domestic politics and the democratic impulse. So, what we'll see is actually a lot of foreign policy is very shaped by domestic policy, domestic concerns, and domestic politics. And so, as your book notes, and we'll review here, you have three types of politics that influence American foreign policy. And the first is what we call majoritarian politics. And so what that simply means is that you have decisions, or what we say is non-decisions, that confer widely distributed benefits and impose widely distributed costs. So what that means is that, for example, when the United States decides to go to war, that's a type of majoritarian politics, because you have to have mass approval, appeal, or at least support. And that the idea is that the goals of the war would support larger and groups of people, so it would distribute benefits to the masses of the United States, and not necessarily to one group. So that the idea is that we're fighting the war for the freedom, protection of U.S. interests, or the United States, which will protect all Americans and distribute that benefit to all Americans. Now, you have to assume that the war is going to do that. And the United States has had some wars that it's engaged in where people have asked the question, was this in fact something that widely distributed benefits to all Americans? Did these wars in fact meet these mission parameters? And of course, at the same time, when you do go to war, the costs of war are in fact quite distributed among the majority of Americans, at least the ones who all pay taxes, because taxpayers are asked to foot the bill of the war. And as we're finding out, that can be a lot more expensive than whatever than what many people assume. So we have majoritarian politics. So the costs of these policies can be highly concentrated. So soldiers bear the burden, as your book notes, of military operation. But you also have people who have to conduct war. The negotiation of peace and the administration of the peace. So you also have one group in America that's also disproportionately affected by the warfare, and that would be the soldiers, especially the ones who are asked not only to fight the wars, but also asked to administer places in times of peace or in times of transition. So at the same time, one of the ways that majoritarian politics can be played is by influencing mass opinion and saying that, everyone has their own part. And this was real common during, say, the Second World War. Everyone has their part in this war, whether you are on the front carrying a rifle or you're working in a factory making the machines that put us to war. The understanding is that both obviously are important. And you can't have the person on the front without giving that person the equipment he needs to fight the war. And so production becomes incredibly important. So everyone has a role, every single person. And so that's one of the ways that majoritarian politics can be played during a war, is that not only do you masses of people have to consent to the war, which they do through their representatives in Congress, the congressional declaration, but you also have sort of an ongoing program where people of all kinds are participating in the war effort, even if they can't or are not even allowed to sign up. Some people worked in occupations where they were not even allowed to go to war. They were told, no, you're not going. You're absolutely needed here, say, managing a munitions factory. So no, we're not sending you to war. Interest groups and interest group politics also play a part in foreign policy. This is especially the case with tariffs, because a tariff is a protective tax, a tax to protect a particular industry in the United States, while also raising the domestic price of an imported foreign good. So in the case of, say, automobiles, this happened in the 1980s. American auto companies wanted time to retool so that they could more evenly compete with Japanese imports, especially in the wake of the energy crises of the 70s and the inroads that Japanese auto manufacturers had made in the United States. President Reagan was successfully lobbied, as was Congress, and they passed a bill to raise protective tariffs on American cars at the time. This was to give them that time. Now, what you have is a protective tariff is something that raises costs for all consumers. But at the same time, it confers benefits to only a small group, a small interest group. And so this is something that's meant by interest group politics, and one of the issues of ways that interest group politics is influenced by foreign policy. So another example of the types of politics influencing foreign policy are called client politics. So in client politics, the United States provides some form of aid to a company, an American company that does business overseas, because it helps the United States achieve some of its foreign policy goals. And that aid goes directly to the firms and helps them without sort of spreading the cost around like a tariff. So for example, the United States might give money to a company it thinks is promoting American interests and doing things in foreign countries. In return for them agreeing to continue doing business abroad, because that's one way the United States thinks it might achieve foreign policy goals. So these are three types of ways that American foreign policy can be influenced, different types of politics that influence it. The other thing that you also have is the roles of elite opinion versus mass opinion. And in this case, what you have is public opinion that is, we'll see, is divergent. So most Americans know very little about the world around them. And as we're seeing from more and more surveys and studies, with the continued evisceration of classes dedicated to teaching government, politics, foreign government, foreign history, and foreign culture, as well as U.S. history and U.S. culture, most Americans struggle with understanding the complexity of American foreign policy goals and understanding foreign cultures on their own terms, so that the people in a democratic system could make informed decisions about foreign policy. Lacking this, mass opinion is easily swayed because it's poorly informed about foreign affairs. Additionally, with the change in news coverage that we talked about in the media unit, you also see that traditional outlets and ways that Americans gain information about foreign policy has also diminished considerably. And so Americans don't even get the information they used to have just 20 and 30 years ago. So with the lack of coverage and everything else, the question becomes, how does mass opinion influence foreign policy, and should it? Foreign affairs are something that most Americans care to ignore. We don't pay much attention to it. And so it's often swayed, especially by things like worldviews. And I think one of the reasons why we started off this presentation the way we did, talking about federal spending, is because Americans are so ill-informed about foreign policy and don't have many opportunities to sort of learn about it. It's assumed that the United States is just giving out money the way you might hand out free samples of candy at a candy store or something. Not really doing that, but it reflects sort of this certain American paranoia about for some reason our government is just giving away a bunch of free stuff to non-Americans. And so mass opinion on foreign policy, it can be swayed through especially through effective media campaigns. Now you have political elites who are better informed about foreign policy issues, and what we've seen is that people who with little knowledge of it, so mass opinion, tends to stay the same in some cases, while elite opinions could change very rapidly, because as more information becomes available to them and they get it, they're more willing to change their mind based on whatever information they've had. One of the classic examples of this change is the Vietnam War. So when we look at that, for example, during the period of the Vietnam War, most of the people who were elites did not even have necessarily their immediate family members even drafted in the war, fighting in the war, unless they enlisted, unless they signed up for it, because their children or themselves would have been immune from the draft, in part from the exemptions required or the exemptions allowed for college attendance, these sorts of things. And early on, elites support the war as an important part of American foreign policy goals. It's stopping or containing communism, helping a foreign government that's trying to survive against communist invasion and an infiltration and all of these things. And by 1968, the elite opinion changed as better information became available. A number of them realized that the United States was fighting a war to support a government that it did not even enjoy the support of its own people. The only thing keeping that government alive was U.S. aid and the U.S. military presence. And so the question becomes, why is the United States fighting this war? What about the goals of anti-communism? Oh, maybe the way we figured that was wrong. So you'll see elites start to change on the question. However, what you'll see are the masses, especially a number of people who might have family members, relatives, friends fighting in the war, drafted or enlisted in the war, has supported the war. They might not have agreed with the war, and you find a number of people who didn't necessarily agree with it. A lot of blue-collar workers who didn't, but they also didn't like protesters. They thought protesters were sending a bad message and that they were attacking the troops. And it's not the troops' fault. They're being sent to do their job and everything else. So what you get is when we talk about Nixon's Hard Hat Rebellion of 1970 in the Civil Rights Act of 1964 as a case study presentation, one of the things we saw is the Hard Hat Rebellion. So the Hard Hat Rebellion people would be the masses in this case, and their foreign policy knowledge is not very good. They are not necessarily as informed as they could be. And what happened here is that their opinions about the war didn't really change. So what we'll also see is that there will be this constant conflict between mass and elite opinion. And how does mass opinion get mobilized? Sort of up for grabs. So if you take a look at that over time, we'll see a wide difference in foreign policy views between these two groups, and it becomes even more divergent now than it ever has been before. So one of the things shaping foreign policy is worldview. As your book notes, worldviews are opinions or ways of how the United States should respond to world problems. And you could even go further and say, worldviews are ways that we look at the world around us, especially in times when we lack data, right? So there are four sort of worldviews that tend to dominate, American foreign policy in the modern era. And it's isolation, containment, disengagement, and human rights. And so if we look at these four, these are identified by your book as well as the four dominant sort of worldviews shaping American foreign policy in the 20th century and early 21st century. And if we go all the way back to the founding of America, the first you might find is a debate between sort of involvement or non-involvement. So basically a foreign policy that was very active or at least engaging the rest of the world, and then a more isolationist foreign policy. And in fact, this word isolationism could describe one of the main goals of American foreign policy pretty much from the founding of the United States really through the late 1800s, early 1900s. And then a return to that after the First World War. So by the 1920s, there's a return to sort of a more isolationist policy. And all that simply is, if our worldview is this way, we should see the world and respond to world problems. What isolationism was basically that the United States should not really participate in world affairs, stay away, not get entangled in, say, European affairs. This was a warning by George Washington in his farewell address and was treated as one of the wisest things he ever said. It became sort of a part of American policy, foreign policy for many years. Sort of the wisdom of the great father of the nation, George Washington, simply saying, avoid European entanglements. Especially in this case, what he was talking about was the French Revolution and its aftermath. Isolationism was American foreign policy. That really started to change after the Civil War, especially as the United States had increased in its manufacturing capacity, and while other countries around the world were scouring the world looking for sources of natural resources, the United States didn't really have to so much because it had, compared to Europe, compared to other countries, other areas of the world. So the major countries of Europe didn't really have the same wealth of natural resources the United States have. So they started looking outside of their own countries for these resources and taking more colonies. So this is the time, for example, that Africa goes from almost exclusive home rule to having a number of parts of Africa colonized. Same with the Middle East. Why? It's because of European desire for the acquisition of these goods, these natural resources to fuel its manufacturing economy. The United States didn't really need to get involved to find those resources, but in some cases did, in other cases took an active interest in the age of imperialism as a way of protecting its borders or advancing its own trade agendas. The United States, of course, breaks isolationism and gets involved in the First World War. Of course, late. The United States comes to the First World War in 1917. The war started in 1914. But it's after the First World War that a number of Americans sort of say, well, look, that's what happens when you get entangled in European affairs. Let's stay out of it. And there's a new commitment to isolationism in the United States in the 1920s. America, mass politics are against the Treaty of Versailles, which would have the United States participate in a League of Nations that would be sort of the precursor to the United Nations. So Americans wanted to withdraw from that. The Republican opposition certainly did. And the United States did not participate in the League of Nations and did not sign the Treaty of Versailles, which our own president helped to negotiate. So you go from that, and of course, what happens during the age of isolationism is the League of Nations doesn't work so well and is unable to prevent the advance of fascism in Europe and the start of the Second World War. After the Second World War and the increasing concern and rivalry between the United States and the Soviets, especially as they remained to be two superpowers, the next phase is called containment. And so the United States sees a disturbing development with the Soviets as they try to not only take over the countries that they liberate from Germany as well as others, but also try to make pro-communist governments there. And the United States takes a new policy called containment, which said that the United States had to show commitment to containing communism wherever it was and not allowing it to expand, regardless of its economic, political, or military value. So if it was an empty rock in the Pacific Ocean, then the United States would defend that rock and prevent communism from spreading there. So containment becomes this way of dealing with aggressive nations, that you contain them, which makes them see your level of commitment, and then that will back off. Containment has some key moments, right? The United States gets involved with the UN action in Korea, and the UN action in Korea is to retaliate and save the South Korean from being overrun by communist North Korea. So once again, an issue of containment, showing the Soviets that, hey, in Korea we're going to fight this. The same in Vietnam. However, after Vietnam, the Vietnam experience, and many Americans wondering what exactly the mission was, especially if the government itself was not well liked by its own people. The next phase became what we might call disengagement. Disengagement is the result of the Vietnam experience. So there are ways that people who believe in disengagement will act, is that they believe the United States was hurt by the Vietnam experience, by the war there, and should not get entangled in a similar style conflict. And so what they say is no more Vietnams ever again. This actually has resulted in things like the Powell Doctrine, which means that are you fighting the correct war? Have you exercised every other option known before you go to war? Are you sure? And then once you do just make the decision to go to war, you make overwhelming allocations of force to be effective. The problem is that this disengagement strategy can often be seen by some people as isolationism, or a new form of isolationism, basically saying there's no war worth fighting, it will get bogged down, we'll lose, everything else. This was certainly the case as a number of people at first felt concern by the Operation Desert Storm in 1991, when the United States committed to moving Saddam Hussein's Iraqi army with a UN coalition out of Kuwait, a nation he invaded, and protecting the sovereignty of Kuwait. There were a number of Americans saying it's going to be Vietnam all over again, and it turned out to be a very lopsided victory for the United States and the United Nations, and of course beginning a military intervention in that area that would go on until today. It's that disengagement that still stayed with the United States. So, in other words, one of the fights over the war on terror, or the war in Iraq, the questions a number of people have had: was this the right war to fight? Did we pick up another Vietnam? That sort of thing. But at the same time, we also have to think: are we saying that all wars are just because bad things are going to happen? Does it mean we don't fight them? So what the disengagement group is really trying to accomplish is making sure we've asked all of the proper questions before going to war, that we've done our due diligence as a country. Human rights becomes another part of American foreign policy, especially in the aftermath of the the ethnic cleansing and the civil war in the Balkans in the mid 1990s. It's at this time that with the war in Kosovo and Serbia, you have President Bill Clinton was elected on domestic issues. In fact, George Bush in 1992 ran on a foreign policy plan. It was actually Bill Clinton who ran on domestic policy, constantly reiterating the line, "It's the economy. It's the economy. It's the economy." The United States was experiencing a short recession. It's the economy, he kept saying, and that's actually what helped him get elected. It was Bush who actually made foreign policy a major issue. But Clinton's attention span to foreign policy, of course, really changed after this episode. Now, one of the questions we have in the modern era, or the era since Clinton, since President Bush, and since the terrorist attacks on 9/11, is that what's the next worldview that we see? Is the United States going to be a leader or a steward in the world that relies on coalitions, that works with coalitions, and maybe tempers some of its some of its plans in order for the benefits of working with a coalition and generating consensus among a community of nations? Or will the United States decide that its best interest is served by doing what it feels it needs to do and not waiting for such consensus? In other words, going alone or being a lone wolf. I'm sure there's a wolf pack of one joke in there. That's one of the questions, especially in light of President Bush attempting to get a coalition to go into Iraq in 2003. The UN Security Council denying it, having a coalition put together, and then some of the coalition backing out or not being all that committed. And then the question becomes, is the United States going to be a country that goes it alone or tries to work with a family of nations towards collective security? So certainly some worldviews that have influenced these worldviews have influenced foreign policy. The other thing, of course, is domestic politics. Polarization, political polarization, is something that has gotten worse over time, not better. And don't underestimate the power of polarization. So, for example, a number of liberals will say, hey, the war in Iraq is wrong, or this was wrong, that was wrong, whereas some more conservative people might have said, yes, it was absolutely right, and we're doing the right thing. And that polarization is certainly part of domestic politics as well, and will influence foreign policy. You also have a relationship between that Dwight Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex and warned against during his farewell address. Basically what we call an iron triangle, if we think about it, because it resembles a triangle. And if we draw here, I'll draw a triangle. I know my drawing skills are the reason you sign up for the course. But what does this mean? If we think of each leg of the triangle as a group, this will be for Congress, okay? This will be, say, for the military, and this will be for defense industries or contractors. And what this simply means is that military needs the defense contractors' equipment and develops relations with them. And the defense contractors develop good relations with the military if they're going to be successful. And so what they do is they work to sell their goods. And in fact, some retired military people might be hired by defense contractors to be liaisons with military people. They will lobby Congress and give money to Congress people for campaigns and these sorts of things. And then Congress will appropriate budgets to the military. So what we see is this cycle of how it's in the best interest of each party to mutually support each other. This is called an iron triangle. It is also, in this case, referred to as the military-industrial complex, which is allegedly the alliance between military leaders and corporate leaders. And so if there's an advantage for military operation, they profit. They lobby Congress for the support of the military plans and budgets, and Congress relies on this money to help get elected. So that's sort of an iron triangle, and one example of one in the military-industrial complex. So something influential in domestic politics, for sure. And so domestic politics, as I say, it influences, it influences foreign policy. A lot of times we don't think of it, but it certainly does. The president. One of the things we also have to think about is what is the role of the president in foreign policy? Well, the president often will negotiate treaties. He's the head of the armed forces. He's the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. He has the authority to send the military to engage it and send it out. There are limits to the president's power. And so one of the chief powers he has, of course, other than the commander-in-chief, and he negotiates treaties with the advice and consent of the Senate. But he also has the ability to mobilize the army without a congressional declaration of war as part of his powers. But after the experience of Vietnam, where Congress basically voted a bill called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which gave President Johnson a blank check, and for the years before, Kennedy had been sending military advisors without a congressional declaration. What this did was required a congressional oversight without a congressional declaration of war. It said that the president could send troops, could call up the troops and use them. However, the president has a 48-hour reporting window, which means that he has to advise Congress within 48 hours of mobilizing the troops, and that's pretty firm. So he can't just start sending out the military willy-nilly. So he has to report to Congress in writing within 48 hours that he's introduced American troops to an area. Within 60 days, if it's going to be more than 60 days, the president needs a congressional authorization. Also, without congressional authorization, the president must withdraw those troops unless Congress was prevented from meeting by some sort of attack. And if it's non-vetoable, if Congress passes a concurrent resolution, which the president may not veto, which directs the removal of U.S. troops, the president must comply. So, there are checks on the president's ability to use the armed forces as he wishes. But what we see is that some of the tools for carrying out American foreign policy are in the hands of the executive office, and there's ways of activating them without necessarily having mass appeal. So, foreign policy, some of the nuts and bolts. As we move on, we'll talk about foreign policy and games.